But when they hit the film, they dropped back down. The minute they started to fall, that fish moved right in, ate that bug, and the other three hanging up in the film. And then I realized what I was doing wrong. What I'd been doing wrong is I was trying to imitate the pupa by stripping, retrieving through that zone. The fish or the insect that I'm imitating is not moving, and I was moving the fly, and they know the difference.
That was Denny Rickards talking about the proper way to present the fly in Stillwater. This is episode number 64 of the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today. We'll help you on your fly fishing journey with classic stories covering steelhead fishing, fly tying, and much more.
How's it going, everyone? Thanks for stopping by the Fly Fishing Show. Quick shout out to our new patron, Brian Moffitt. Thank you for joining the tribe here. You can go to wetflyswing.com/Patreon to help our little micro movement we got going here. Please take a moment also to head over to, if you want to subscribe to the show, just go to wetflyswing.com/subscribe and you can quickly join the team there as well. In today's episode, I chat with Denny Rickards, one of the best and biggest Stillwater guides in our area, and a guy who really brings it on today. We talk about the most common Stillwater mistakes, when and where to find fish, and his favorite line he uses most of the time. Denny talks about why not moving your fly is key, the best colors to find fish and to use on your flies, and how he starts his day every time in the lake. Don't miss this as Denny takes us back and talks to us about how he almost had a professional baseball career and how this path changed abruptly. So, without further ado, here's Denny Rickards from flyfishingstillwaters.com.
How's it going, Denny?
Just great, Dave. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. We, I've been chatting with a few of my buddies and talking to some people about you and if, having some questions and things like that. You're obviously a big name in the Stillwater game. I've actually only had, I think to this point, one guest that's been a Stillwater guest, at least with that focus. But other than that, I'm hoping to dig in and answer some questions here. But before we jump into all the Stillwater stuff, maybe you can just talk about how you first got into fly fishing and then how you brought it up to, where you have a business in fly fishing.
Well, it's one of those things, Dave. I think with everybody that likes to fish, I got hooked on it when I was still 5, 6 years old. My dad owned a sporting goods store, but he didn't know anything about fishing, so he didn't have a lot of fishing tackle around yet. Looking at other people fishing in those days, I'm going back 60 years or so, and watching them just put a bobber out there with a worm underneath it and watching that bobber bounce around, it did something to me. But as I grew older and a young adult, I was doing schools and clinics and stuff when I lived up at Lake Tahoe and helping people, writing a column in the local paper. But it was one afternoon, I walked across the street and I saw some fish coming up to some dry flies. And I hadn't done any fly fishing. I knew about it, but I hadn't done it. And watching what was going on, I went over and got a rod that was given to me with an automatic reel. I didn't know what a leader was or what the 4X, 2X, any of that stuff was, or tapered leaders. All the terminology that went with the sport, I was totally in the closet. But I went down and bought some dry flies from a local sporting goods store, walked across the street, never cast a line in my life, but somehow I was able to work it and get it underneath this limb where these fish were hanging, and I caught 4, believe it or not, and they were up to 20 inches on dry flies, browns, and it was the upper Truckee River that comes into Lake Tahoe, so that got me hooked, that got me started.
Cool. So, so you grew up in the Lake Tahoe area, and you mentioned your dad's sporting goods store. What was the name of that store, and what year was that? Did he also have
couldn't tell you. It was when I was just a real youngster living in Hollywood. That was 50, 60 years ago.
Gotcha. Okay. But, yeah, you've pretty much been fishing or been into the outdoors most of your life. Mm-hmm. Obviously you've been doing this a long time. And so where did I don't know if there's a transition, but when did you become the Stillwater? When did all that take place when you kind of became this expert on Stillwaters?
Well, it was one of those days, Dave, I was living at Tahoe, and I'm always fishing the lakes and streams around the area. But back into the late 50s, early 60s, I was a lure fisherman, and believe it or not, I was deadly with a night crawler. God, I could go out and get those big fish with that stuff. And I went over to a lake one afternoon and had been trolling plugs and took a break, and I saw fish rolling out there. I knew they were coming up for bugs. Well, for whatever the reason, I got back in the truck, got the fly rod out, and went out and tried making a few casts. That was my first experience on Stillwater, and I actually caught a few fish. Didn't have a clue what I was doing. I didn't know anything about the sport, but it was enough that as I grew older and got, in those days, we got into graphite rods, because before that it was bamboo and glass. So anyway, as I grew older, I just started doing more and more on Stillwater, and the lure of bigger fish, which we have in lakes compared to streams and rivers, and all the solitude that went with it, and the beauty of the high country lakes. This is something I wanted to learn, and that just started me off in that direction.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so you just went all in, and now you're kind of doing the show circuit, and you're kind of everything Stillwaters. Do you still do, do you ever do any like stream fishing at all, or is it pretty much all Stillwaters all the time?
Oh, no, hell, we live on a ranch. It's a 30-acre ranch. My wife raises Arabian horses, and we have Fort Creek here out of Fort Klamath runs. It's 10 feet from the house where I'm talking to you right now, and it's a gin clear stream. It doesn't change temperature all year. It's Spring Creek. Average depth is probably 2 to 3 feet, and it's all native brown, rainbow, and brook, and we own both sides, and it's a non-navigable creek, so no one can come down on a boat on it. So anyway, no, I still do that. What really got me flipped over onto the Stillwater side is when I bought a resort here in Fort Klamath, over at Rocky Point on Upper Klamath Lake. That's where I really learned the Stillwater side of things, because I fished every day and was guiding almost every day for 11 years. Oh,
gotcha. Yeah. And what was the name of the resort?
It was Rocky Point Resort on Upper Klamath Lake.
Wow.
And being on the water every day, you can't help but learn.
Is that resort still out there, still going?
Oh, yeah. I still go over there. I keep my boat moored there. I'm on the lake probably 3 to 4 days. Throughout the entire season. I'm still getting 220 plus days a year on the water.
Wow. And are you running that resort, or are you still connected with that?
No. I sold it about 10 years ago, and it's gone through several owners, but I go over to fish the lake because anybody that knows about Upper Klamath knows it's probably the best trophy lake in the West as far as rainbows up to 20 pounds out there.
Yeah. And I've fished a little bit. I've fished Upper Klamath and some of the rivers that feed in there too. That's the cool thing about the Klamath Lake system is you get these rainbow trout that are kind of like it's like steelhead almost, right? They're using their lake as their ocean, and kind of like a Great Lake, similar to a Great Lakes sort of thing, right?
They're a cross between rainbow. It's a native rainbow in the lake is an Upper Klamath Lake rainbow, and Bob Bemke, who used to write for Trout Unlimited magazine, I think it was Trout Unlimited magazine, or the FFF, I'm not sure which it was, but anyway, he was up and told me that, you have, when you look at all different species of rainbow, you've got kamloops and the Eagle Lake rainbow. Well, there's an Upper Klamath Lake rainbow that's a totally different, distinctive, different breed. But there's two others that people don't even know about. That one only goes into the lake occasionally during the year, and the coloration is totally different. It's more olive with some spots around the gill plate and down by the tail. The rest of it's just an olive look. And the other one is totally different color than that, but it doesn't go to the lake, but it's in the tributaries that feed it. So it's interesting when you catch them and you compare them to see how different they are.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I want to dig into a lot of the all the how-tos and how to catch fish and tips, because I know you've got a ton of resources there we can talk about. But before we jump into that, can you bring us back a little bit on the historical piece? Because we talked a little bit about how you buying a lodge and all that stuff. But can you take us back to, I don't know, maybe some point in the Stillwater history? I don't know if it brings us back to England or whatever, or maybe the U.S., but just how we've come to where it seems like Stillwaters have been around a lot, but you don't hear a ton about them. Has that changed over the years?
Well, what's happened, Dave, if you go back to the 50s, late 50s and early 60s, that's when I started doing Stillwater. And I've been doing it now for over 60 years, fishing lake with a fly. And when I started, all the rods, as I mentioned earlier, were made of bamboo or glass. We didn't have graphite rods. Pontoon boats, they hadn't even been invented yet. They were 20 years away from that time frame. Fluorocarbon leaders, they wouldn't arrive until I think it's the early or late 80s, 90s, somewhere in there. A woolly bugger that everybody fishes today. If he's a fly fisherman, they probably have a woolly bugger in their assortment of flies. That hadn't been designed yet. It was still a woolly worm. No one had thought about putting a marabou tail on it. That didn't happen until almost in the 80s. Wow. And a lot of the things, all the books, and I've done 4 different books on Stillwater, and I went out and did as much research as I could to see what other people thought about it, and couldn't find a thing. There was nothing written. There weren't any articles in the fly fishing magazines. There were no books, and what was written was really very, very elementary. They didn't get into the detail. And what people want to know, as I've learned in guiding for 50 years, people want to know how to catch fish. They need to know what you know. So as we move forward into the sport, we didn't have indicators. No one was fishing indicators and chronomids. No. The word pupa hadn't even been designed for lakes yet. People speak of a pupa pattern. It's really associated with either midges or caddis. There is no such thing as a mayfly pupa. You won't find it in any fly shop. It's not in any book. Worse than that, look at any stream or river guy out there fishing. They don't fish patterns that are pupa patterns. They fish flies that are really larva patterns that the trout take for pupa, but we can get into that later.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's just a how-to thing in the sport. I think a lot of early tradition came from England, but most of the guys back in the 40s and 50s that would fish a lake either did dry fly fishing, which speaks for itself, or else they trolled a fly. Yeah. But that was even seldom done. It just wasn't done. There was no knowledge for anybody to pick up and learn the sport.
That's right. That's right. And
today, right now, though, Dave, it's the fastest growing segment of fly fishing. Just look at all the pontoon boats that are sold every year. Look at how many people, when you go to a lake, that are out there. Most of them are struggling. They don't know a whole lot. Some of them can do okay and catch fish, but when I watch guys out there on the water, I see so many people making the same mistakes that I made 30, 40 years ago and don't know anything different because there's no one to tell them that they're doing it wrong.
Yeah, I know that a bunch of things come to my mind, as you're talking there about the changes. And I mentioned earlier, like it wasn't as popular, but I kind of misspoke. I mean, obviously, definitely lake fishing is huge and lots of people are interested. I love it. I haven't done as much recently, but I think, what do you think for you? What is the thing that really makes lakes, enjoyable over, say, when you compare to stream fishing, or is it kind of an equal thing for you?
No, I love to fish the stream as much as anybody, but I'm getting up there in years now, even though I'm still out there pounding it, and I've got a creek right here next to the house that's loaded with fish. But most guys that get into fly fishing to begin with are taught dry fly fishing, and dry fly fishing on a stream or river is pretty elementary. It's pretty simple. You just match the hatch, put a cast up there. You don't have to know how to cast. You don't throw very far. And if you get it in the lie where the fish is holding and coming up, you're going to catch fish. So if you're not doing that and you're sinking a nymph, you don't need a lot of fly lines. You don't need a floater or a sink tip line to do that. And they throw short lines and control it. And now today, everybody's using bobbers and a fly underneath it, which is a very effective way of doing it. But on lakes, there's different ways, different forms of presentation, and we can get into those whenever you want as to how to go about it and what you need in order to be successful at it. But lakes, for me, it was the lure of the bigger trout.
Okay.
I just, that's what I go after when I'm on the water.
That's it. No, that makes sense. So, okay, let's dig into a little bit. You mentioned, dry flies, streamers and things like that. And there are a bunch of different techniques. And I guess just because we can't cover everything in this, this conversation today, let's try to focus this. And I had Phil Rowley on that I mentioned in the past episode, and we talked a little bit about some of the techniques he does, and I'm sure they're similar to stuff that you do. But do you want to focus a little bit on some of the under the surface sort of stuff as opposed to, not necessarily the streamer stripping stuff. I mean, and I guess that is a question I have as far as trolling. Do you do as much trolling as you do fishing under an indicator?
I do some of it, but where you got to go, Phil Rowley is really a chronomid fisherman.
Yeah.
He's an indicator guy.
Yep.
And I know Phil well. We've been in a lot of shows. I'll see him here in another month at another show that I'll be at. And he and Brian Chan and I, we've talked, and I kid him a lot because to me, fishing under an indicator is boring. It doesn't excite me. I don't have the patience for it. But as far as what they fish on the end of underneath that indicator, whether it's a midge or whatever, I've been doing that for a long time, but I cast and retrieve it. So when you look at a lake, Dave, there's 3 ways to present a fly. Well, actually 4. You can dry fly fish with a floating line on top, or you can use the indicator with a floating line and put a chronomid or a small nymph underneath it. You can troll a fly. You can cast and retrieve a fly. Those are the 4 different ways of doing it. And the cast and retrieving has got so many other factors that affect your success rate that's difficult. If you're a troller, you don't even need a fly rod to go out and troll. You can fish with a fly and put it on the end of a spinning line and put a split shot a few feet up and go troll it. You'll catch all kinds of fish. That's not difficult. And if you're a chronomid fisherman, someone came up with the term indicator. It's nothing different than using a float, and the trout doesn't know what's on top that's holding that thing up.
Yep.
So if you had a spinning rod, you could do it that way. You don't need a fly rod for either those 2 forms of presentation, but we do use fly rods, and we do it because we switch back and forth from one mode to the other. What takes the most presence in understanding what you're doing is the cast and retrieve. And the difference between stream guys and guys who fish lakes, stream guys for the most part, unless they're salmon and steelhead guys, they don't cast very far, and they're not very good casters. They might be fine for 20, 30 feet, but on a lake, distance is critical because of the conditions that we face out there. A lot of days you're going to have those flat days where the water isn't ripply, and you're going to have to crank that thing out there. And then you got to understand the trout's behavior relative to the conditions that exist. But cast and retrieve, it's more about depth on Stillwater. And the depth is controlled by the fly line and making the longer cast. I can give you an example. What I'm talking about, if a guy went out and fished 6 hours, and I asked people, I said, what would put a smile on your face? How many fish do you got to catch to make you happy? And it varies what the number would be. But if you only caught 10 and you put in 6 hours, most people would go home and feel they had a pretty good day. What if it was 20? In 6 hours, you're going to make somewhere between 190 to 200 casts. And if you went home with a 20-fish day, that means 180 casts failed. So our success rate on lakes is not really very good. But we measure it in terms of size and numbers, and that's the way we look at it. But we don't look at where we fail or why we fail. We only look at what we catch, enjoy the hell out of it, and have a good time, and enjoy the ambience of the trees and the wind and the beauty and all that, and that's great. But if guys are going to do lakes and they want to really make the most out of it, I can tell them exactly what they have to do if they want to get big fish versus just catching a fish. Yeah,
let's talk about that, because I think the big fish thing, not everybody obviously is into getting the biggest fish, but I think, a lot of us are. It's fun to catch a big fish and all that. So let's dig into, a little bit, just take us to, you mentioned Upper Klamath, but it can be really any lake probably. Maybe just describe how you get into big fish or some of those bigger fish on the lakes, and where do you start? Just take us to, you get to a new lake, you're new to a lake, you walk up there, maybe you have, I guess the first thing is your boat, you got float tubes, boats, all that stuff. Maybe you can talk about what boat you recommend, and then after that, where do you start?
Well, let's take a lake. Whoever's listening and wants to look at their local lakes, wherever that might be, the first thing they have to look at when you get to a lake is you need to know 2 things, and you can't screw it up. You got to know those 2 things. One, where you're going to put the fly. That's critical. Once you know where you want to fish, assuming the fish are there, the other one, and you have to know it or learn it as soon as possible, which is what depth are the fish at. The answer to both of those questions are relative to the conditions that exist when you get there. And when I'm talking conditions, I'm talking about, is it a cloudy day or a clear day? Is the wind blowing or is it flat? Is the water clear? Is it off color? Is it on the warm side? Is it on the cold side? These are the things that move your fish around from one location to the other and up and down, and it changes throughout the day. Where you catch fish in April at 6 o'clock in the morning probably isn't where you're going to catch them at 10 o'clock in the morning because they're going to move. Yeah. And Mother Nature controls that through water temperature. If you have a cloudy day, the water's going to be slower to warm, which is going to affect the oxygen and pH in the water, so the fish adjust to those sort of things. So when you get to a lake, the first thing that guys need to understand, and this is true, Dave, of all the lakes. I've done probably close to 600, 700 lakes in my lifetime around the world and here in the United States. They're all different. They're at different altitudes. They have different chemistries to them. The habitat are different configurations and all that. But one thing that I found is true on every single one of them, and this will help the guys, if they want to be successful in Stillwater, you must fish where trout feed and not where they hold. Everyone says they go out with a depth finder and they read fish on the bottom. Well, you'll always find fish on the bottom because that's where a trout lives. Where and how deep they go is relative to oxygen and water temperature. And if that water temperature is not to their liking, then they'll move to where it will be. But those changes take place very slowly because the sun, as it comes up, water doesn't change real quick in terms of temperature. It's slow to change, so the fish will adjust to it. So knowing where the fish will feed, they feed shoreline edges early and late in the day, and the big fish don't come into shallow water because they're not smart creatures, but they're instinctively smart. But they know when they enter shallow water, they're subject to predation. So they come in when it's safe.
What is shallow water? What do you think's the limits to shallow versus
From
deep?
Shoreline edge, an inch or two out to 3-4 feet.
Okay.
But when I'm fishing lake, I rarely catch fish deeper than 6 feet. I don't go there. I don't need to go there. But when I fish a shoreline edge, I know one thing. Those big fish that come in to feed on shorelines, and we're not talking little guys. We're talking some of the biggest fish in the lake will come in. You could have a lake, say, that had 500 fish over 4 pounds. Maybe on the given day that you're there, maybe only 50 or 100 are feeding on that shoreline. But that's where they're going to go, and they use the safety of cover. And cover is in the form of darkness or wind ripples. So when they go in there at first light, they're looking for food. They're not looking for a particular fly or a particular food source, just food. So if you're out casting in onto the shoreline edge, the key to catching fish is because the trout on the shoreline are moving parallel hunting. You got to remember, on Stillwater, a fish that feeds is always moving. If he's not moving, then he's hunkered down either in his lair or wherever the water and depth is comfortable for him. But when they move, they only move to feed or to avoid danger. That's the only time a fish moves in a given day, and that's every day after day after day. So when you go on the shoreline, those big fish, they're hunting for food, and there's no little ones in there. They don't run with the big boys. So they're in there hunting, and if you're back out casting in, the advantage to the angler is because the fish is moving parallel, you cast in, he will see the profile view of your fly. So as you pull it out to you, they will see the head, tail, body, color, movement, everything. What the angler has to do is not to retrieve it more than about 4 to 5 feet, because the fish will not go on a given angle wherever he's going parallel and turn and follow the fly out to you. So every 5 feet, pick up and recast. And the biggest mistake that I see guys make when they do this is they stay in one spot too long.
Yeah.
You got to turn your boat sideways and move slowly along the shoreline, covering water as you do that. And the other place where trout feed is in the top 2-3 feet. That's where the food is concentrated. Shoreline edges in the top 2-3 feet, because all of the insects on the bottom, when they travel up through the water column, when they hit that film area just below the surface, they stop and they wait trying to break through that film to become an adult on top. So we need to talk about the different stages and how they take that, and we can do that a little later. But those are the two places that the trout feed. If a guy goes out and turns on a depth finder and sees fish down there 8-10 feet, can you go down and get them? Yes. But it's going to be a challenge, because I've learned when a fish is deeper than 6-7 feet, anybody out there can go out and stick their head underneath the water or get on a mask and go underneath and watch what the fish do. If they're deeper than 6 or 7 feet, they're probably on the bottom and they don't move. They're not hunting. They're stationary. So you're trying to convince a fish that's telling you he's not eating to take your fly. They won't move down there. You got to run that thing almost in front of their nose before they'll take it. But if you can get them to take, Dave, that's where the big fish are caught. Little guys aren't down there with those big guys. They're over where the cover is. They don't run together. So that's why you got to fish where they feed.
I see. Okay. Yeah, no, that's a awesome tip. So basically, if you had to narrow it down, maybe the 2 to 3 foot depth is a good place to be, and catching it early or late as fish are coming into feed. And is there too early? I mean, if you get out there right at daylight, is the water, I guess it depends on temperature and things like that, but do you find that there's maybe one good time in the day that's better than another?
Good question. And what I would say is factor in for everybody, and you got to do this every day that you're on the water, you got to factor in time of day and time of year. So if you're on the water at first light and it's April, conditions are going to be totally different by June. You're going to find the water temperatures along the shoreline are going to be warmer. You might have more weeds growing in there. You just got to factor that in. So a trout, the reason they go in early in the morning is because the water's at its coldest point. It's had all night to cool. So right around that 8:30, 9 o'clock, if it was the 1st of June, you'll notice if you've been along the shoreline and you're hooking some nice fish, and all of a sudden, here's what's going to happen. You're going to find that bite that you've been getting is starting to taper off. And guys, when it happens, what they think, they're not taking this fly anymore, so they make a fly change. That's not the problem. It's not the fly. Every fly we have on our fly box, Dave, imitates food of some kind, either insects or fish. So when you put that fly in there, trout hunt for food. They don't hunt for a particular food source. The only thing that brings big fish into shoreline, and they know it, are baby fish, minnows. But that isn't what they won't say no to a minnow if you threw them a bugger, or if you throw them a bugger in place of the minnow, they'll still take all that stuff. They'll take anything that's presented without flaw, that doesn't spook them. So as you get out there and you proceed along those shoreline edges, right around that 9 o'clock time frame, as the bite starts to slow, the fish are going to move off into deeper water, waiting for the hatches to begin. And that's the key. When you see the hatches, you're going to see fish making rings on the surface. The fisherman knows they're eating either a mayfly, caddis, damsel, or midge. Those are the 4 insects that go from the bottom to the top. And when they reach the top, only the damsel heads to shore. The other 3 hang in the film. So what the angler needs to do, the fish that's making that ring is traveling anywhere from 10 to maybe 12, 13 inches below the surface. Just watch and they'll see. That's where they travel, always looking up. So if you're in 10 feet of water and you see rings, that fish, and what you have to do is you only have a foot of water to play in. You cannot let your fly go below the depth that those fish are cruising, because trout never feed below the level that they're cruising. They don't do it. They're looking up, so you can get them as long as the fly's at his level or above. So then the line that you're using becomes critical for that type of presentation, but we can get into that a little later too. But that's a critical part of the thing that we do on Stillwater.
Okay, let's talk about the lines a little bit. I know, the clear camo is a line I've used in the past. What do you recommend? And I guess in some of these situations where you're only a foot below, maybe you're just using a dry line. Maybe you can talk about that if you are in that situation where fish are hitting those bugs that are hatching. What line, and then maybe talk about your leader and flies as well.
If a guy, Dave, didn't know and he went out and he saw fish working, and I would say probably in all the years that I've guided and I get clients out there, I have to set this up before we're on the water so we don't have any surprises, but most of them would take a floating line. Here's what's wrong with a floating line under this condition. Floaters leave a shadow and reflect light. When they lay on the surface, if you move them and retrieve them to you, you're causing surface disturbance. A floating line in a wind, trout face into a wind. So if you cast across the wind, the line's going to bow in a wind, which is going to cause drag on your fly. So floaters are not a good idea unless you can use a floater with, say, a dry fly and another fly just below it. Use the dry fly as your indicator. That will work, but you can't move it. You got to just leave it there.
What about a really long, what about like a 20 or 30-foot leader or something like that?
You won't see anybody throwing 30-foot leaders, not even 20. In all the years that I've guided, I haven't found a guy yet that wants to use that because they know they can't turn them over. You can turn over a 20-foot leader. To do it, they just have to pause on their back cast to get that back cast tight. Then you can turn it over. But the line that you want to use for that, at least the line that I use, I had the Cortland Line Company make a 7-foot intermediate sink tip. So it's a 90-foot long line. 83 of the 90 feet is floating. The last 7 feet goes from a colored dark green color to clear, and they call it a ghost tip. This is what we termed it and designed it that way. And I had them make it for me just so I could fish the pupa form of the insect. So this is where the pupa is. And before I go into how to use it, Dave, I think it's important that the listeners understand of the aquatic insects, mayfly, caddis, damsel, and midge that we imitate those 4 insects in 3 stages. Larvae, which are found on the bottom, pupa, which are found just below the surface, and then you got the adults on top. You have a 4th stage. It's not really a stage, but it's kind of in between, and that's as the fly leaves the bottom from the larva where they feed and live most of their life. As they travel up through the water, they're in an emerging state. So a fly coming up from the bottom, you fish that, even though it's in pupa form, you fish that pupa and that form of presentation differently than you do when the fly is hanging in the film. So here's how you go about it. I had the 7-foot designed, the 7-foot sink tip. It's a camo tip on a floater designed for me just to keep it in that top 2 feet. I can cast that line out and I can retrieve it and stay in the top 2 feet throughout my entire retrieve. If you used a full sinking intermediate line, which will also work, but it only works for about the first 5 feet of the retrieve, because the full sinking line is just that. The camo's a full sinking line, and it's designed to fish the top 6 feet, but it sinks 1 foot in 10 seconds. So as the guy retrieves the line across, after about 5 feet, you've dropped below that foot level where the trout are cruising, and you don't get hit. You get it at the beginning, or you get it at the back end as you're coming up. And everybody that's fished a lake has caught fish just as they're ready to pick up the line and make another cast. What you're doing is you're imitating an emerging insect. And Hal Jansen told me, good friend of mine, 15 years ago, he said, Denny, just remember this. He says, when you're retrieving the back end of your cast, as you're ready to pick up and make that next cast, trout never, and he emphasized the word never take on the pull. They always take on the pause between the pulls. Took me a while before I understood what he meant, but I tried his system on the way up and putting longer pauses between my pulls, and boy, it works. But half the time you don't know when the fish takes, because when you pause, your fly's dropping back, and that creates slack, and the fish just sits there and sucks that bug in. You don't know it till you go to pull again on your retrieve, and then you feel the line is tighter, you feel a head shake, and you set the hook. So that's the way you fish that. But what he was really trying to tell me is, trout, when you pause, your fly drops back down. So when you're casting the fish that are feeding near the surface, here's how you tell the difference, Dave. A trout that's taking the adult insect off the top, when you see a ring on the surface, if you only see the ring, or maybe the trout's nose, that fish is feeding on adults, sucking them under. If you're in doubt, just look at the ring and you'll see there's a bubble in the middle of it. They get air when they get those adults off the top. But if the fish porpoises, shows his back and tail, those fish are moving very slow. And that guy is feeding on pupa just below. He takes the pupa on his way up, shows his back and tail, and goes back down very slow, and he probably gets another gulp as he goes down. Those fish can be caught, and here's how you do it. It took me a long time, almost 30 years of failure, trying to catch that fish that was porpoising before I finally figured out what it was. And I did it on a lake up in Wyoming. I was watching these insects that were laying just below the surface in pupa form, and I could see some fish cruising over to them. And one of the three fish, two of them veered off, and the other one stopped. And I know he's looking at those insects. He's only 4 feet away, and I'm about 6 feet away from that fish. And he stopped looking at those insects. And about that time, there were two more insects that came up. And when they hit the surface, they didn't break through the surface film as these other three hadn't, but when they hit the film, they dropped back down. The minute they started to fall, that fish moved right in, ate that bug, and the other three hanging up in the film. And then I realized what I was doing wrong. What I'd been doing wrong is I was trying to imitate the pupa by stripping, retrieving through that zone. The fish or the insect that I'm imitating is not moving, and I was moving the fly, and they know the difference. So what I did to adjust to that, to make it work, I make a cast and count 5 seconds. Half the time I don't even get to 5. The fish sees the bug, picks it up, and your line just all of a sudden comes tighter. He takes off with it. If you don't get a strike within 5 seconds, then I pull toward me 4 to 6 inches, and usually the fish has the fly already, just took it while it was sinking. And then when I tighten the line up to him, he feels that tension, and then he bolts. So one of the two will work. And if you don't get a strike on a 5 count or a pull, then the fish that you cast to is gone. Didn't see it, didn't like it, you spooked him with a cast. That's okay. You have two options: pick up and recast to another spot, or you start retrieving coming back to you. If you catch a fish on the retrieve, after you've made your cast, fish always comes in from the side, so he sees the fly in profile view. That's critical. And how the angler will know that that's true, when he lands the fish, just look and see where the hook is.
Yep.
It'll always be in the side of the mouth, either one side or the other.
That's right.
So that's critical to the catch rate, but guys can do either one, but that's how you fish pupa, and it's consistent on any lake that I've fished. And when I have clients, that's what we do.
Wow. Yeah, you just packed a bunch of great stuff in there. Going back, I guess starting on the count there, the 5 count and pull. So are there other, you're talking about fishing pupa, are there other, I know there's a lot of different strip techniques and stuff like that. Is that something you want to talk a little bit about, and how you might vary? Because I've done that before too, like you're talking the slower stripping, but when would you change that up and do something maybe faster or longer or just different?
If I start my day, Dave, I always start it with a bugger, a leech, or a minnow imitation, and I start it along the shoreline.
And what fly?
I don't get.
And what fly is do you start with? What's your go-to fly?
Probably a streamer, and I've got those that I sell to the public, there's 12 different varieties of streamers that I sell. These are just patterns that I've designed over the years that imitate bait fish, and as I travel around the world, always looking at the little fish in different lakes, and I found about 80% of all the minnows that I find in lakes around the country or in other countries, they're mostly pearl or white on the belly, and they have either an olive or grayish, dark gray back.
Yeah.
So what's more important when you're talking about streamers is matching size more than color. Size is number one. So when I do that, I'll fish a leech or my seal bugger. When I see fish beginning to make rings on the surface, and it won't be early as a rule, it's usually after 8 o'clock in the morning in the summer months, that means they're coming up for aquatic insects. When they do that, I switch lines from the intermediate to the 7-foot tip, although I could use either one for shoreline fishing, and then I'll go to the 7-foot tip, and I'll probably stay with that line for most of the rest of the day, because the hatch and the bugs that you see up there, the fish coming up to them, could probably last the rest of the day. To do that, it's a no-brainer. I'm fishing top 2-3 feet. What a lot of guys don't understand about Stillwater, Dave, is that most of the fish that we catch, and I can go back into my logs, holy cow, I do somewhere between 500 to 600 trout a year over 4 pounds, but I'm on lakes, especially upper Klamath, where there's just a lot of big fish. Most of those fish are caught in the morning hours, and most of them are caught in depths less than 6 feet.
There you go.
I don't fish deep. I don't need to go down there and chase those guys to do that, because they're looking for food along the shoreline. And if you're in a pupa hatch, you've got to stay close to the weed beds. That's where you'll find most of the insects. Just get back, watch for a porpoising fish, make your cast. You got a leading. When the fly hits, do as I told you. Just give it a 5 count. If they don't take in 5 seconds, then give it a slight pull. If you still don't have him, you can continue to pull, or you can pick up and recast another fish. But it's very, very consistent. And then I'll switch off of that line and the little flies. And when we're talking flies, I always ask guys, and here's a good question for guys to stop and analyze. Most of the people that fish lakes have got hare's ear, pheasant tail nymphs, prince nymphs, stuff like that. All of those flies are really pupa imitations. Most of the flies we have on our fly box are pupa imitations, but we don't call them that. They have different names, but they're really a pupa imitation if they're small stuff. Other than a scud or something like that, it's a pupa or a larva imitation. Because when I talked, the last book that I did, I talked to 6 or 7 biologists around the country. And these guys, I said, when you guys are out in the field doing your research, I said, do you record the information that you get when you're checking the stomach contents of fish? And he says, yeah, what do you want to know? And I said, I want to know if you eliminate leeches, scuds, minnows, all that stuff, just aquatic insects, of the 3 stages, pupa, larva, and adult, what percent was the larva? Almost every one of them said about 10%. And I said, what percent was the adult? They said about 10%. Yep. And I said to him, are you telling me that 80% of what trout eat in Stillwater is in larva form? And he says, that's right. So all I had to do is figure out where the trout feed on the larva. They don't feed, or pupa. They don't feed deep. That's the larva, and they don't take them very often. They feed on the pupa when they get up and hang in the film because they're vulnerable. They're just sitting there. So that became pretty easy. Learn the depth. I've got all kinds of flies that I sell to the public that are pupa imitations, even though I call them something different. Apia merger, calabatus nymph, midge larva, midge pupa, Stillwater nymph. They're all really pupa imitations.
Nymph,
yeah, and if you go back to when Lee Wolf, one of the last articles that he did before he passed away, is he did an article on some streams and rivers on the East Coast, and he showed you a picture of a mayfly, a caddis, a damsel, and a midge. And he showed you the pupa form of those 4 insects upside down. He took a picture, showed you what the insect looked like from the bottom. They all looked the same. You couldn't tell which was which. So when a trout hunts, he's not focused on which insect is hatching. He's focused on which stage of the insect is hatching. They don't care if it's a mayfly, caddis, damsel, or midge either. It's pupa, which means top 2 or 3 feet. That's where he's going to hunt. If the fly doesn't enter the water and spooks a fish, you're going to catch him.
Gotcha.
It's that simple.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's some more good stuff there. I was thinking back to, you mentioned the lines again. So we're talking in these links, you mentioned the 7-foot your line. I'll provide a link at wetflyswing.com/64 in the show notes. I'll have links to the stuff we're talking about here. But so you have the 7-foot line, and then you have the clear intermediate, or just the intermediate line. So that's pretty much it. If you have to get 2 lines, if you had to get 3, would you add one there?
Well, you want the floater for your adults and indicator fishing. Your intermediate line, the full sinking intermediate, is really designed to fish the top 6 feet. Because when you first enter a lake, if it's early in the morning, for the most part, you're not going to see any insects hatching. So you're going to stay in that. You want to stay in the top 2, 3, 4 feet and down to as much as 6 feet to run your flies through those zones. Guys got to remember, when a trout is deeper than about 6 feet, they're not moving, Dave. That's critical to our presentation. When they're in the top 2, 3 feet, yes, they are moving. And on most lakes in the summer months, here's an example of what I'm talking about that'll affect the guy's presentation. Right around 9, 10 o'clock, the sun is up, it's a clear day, your water temperature has already changed from a degree or 2, it's warmed up. As the water warms, the fish are going to tell you this, you don't have to wonder it. You will find that even though you were casting and retrieving and doing very well in the first few hours, casting and pulling your fly parallel across in the top 2, 3 feet, you're going to see that strike ratio begin to taper off. You're not getting as many fish, and the reason for it is the trout are dropping down a few feet where the oxygen level is back to their norm where they like it. And that top surface area, pH changes, which means less dissolved oxygen up there, so they just drop down into the 4, 5, 6 foot range. Now, if you continue to pull, whether it's a foot under 2 feet down to 4 or 5 feet, and you pull parallel, they don't want a parallel pull. They're waiting for the fly to come up on an angle as an emergent insect. And the fish that you're fishing for is not moving. He's stationary. So as you cast and retrieve and you start coming up, we're talking 20 feet in front of you, 30 feet in front of you, and 4 to 5, 6 feet down. That's where your fish is. That's the fish that you're fishing for, whether you want to or not. And as you get hit, you got to remember, it's that pause between the pulls. When the fly drops back down, that's when they take. But you'll notice that a parallel pull up higher doesn't work very good until the hatch starts to recede. Then I go back to the big flies toward the end of the day, and I fish the big flies either closer to the shore. But another thing to remember about that too, Dave, when trout are on a shoreline and they leave that area, they don't go to the middle of the lake and hunker down on the bottom. They go where it's about 8 to 10 feet. Why would a fish travel all the way to the center of the lake and have to burn all those calories and energy to come back? They don't do that. They hang where they're always close to where their food sources are. They aren't going to make that extra effort to go out there. So if you're casting into a shoreline, you're probably 40 to 50 feet out. Just stick your rod down if you don't have a depth finder and find out what the depth is. If you got a 9-foot rod and you hit bottom before you get to 9 feet, you know you're less than 9 right there. Yeah. So if you cast in the shore, you've got that advantage, or you can cast out the deeper water, fish the top 2-3 feet. That's where I get my clients to fish, and that's where we catch all our trout.
No, that's cool.
Day in, day out.
Yeah, that makes it. I mean, you've definitely streamlined it for somebody, who's maybe new to it, understanding that, and I think I've fallen in that trap too, where you get out in the lake and you're trolling around the lake and you're covering everything, but it's, probably more than half the time you're not even going over fish. So the fact
you mentioned trolling, and let's talk for just a second for the guys that like to troll. Trolling, there's nothing wrong with it. It's not fly fishing. It's moving with a fly. You're fishing a fly. Even though you got a fly rod, you're not fly fishing, you're trolling. But it's very, very effective. And what you're trying to find out when you troll, you will find there's certain places on a lake where you get a lot more strikes than you get in other places. The troller has to remember, when you troll, it's all about depth, and it's relative to the speed you go and how much line you put out, regardless of what the sink rate is of the line. You retard the sink rate when you move the boat a little faster in the water, so you can control that. If the angler will keep his fly 40 to 60 feet behind the boat, going on a slow troll, and that's a relative term, but relatively slow. If it's not working, you can pick up the speed. What you're trying to do is keep the fly in the top 2-3 feet. You don't want it going deeper. There's no advantage to that. So if you keep it in the top few feet as you're trolling along, you're going to hook fish. And when you hook them, most of those fish, I would say 95 to 98% of those fish always come in from the side. You're trolling on a straight line. Look at the way we present our flies to fish. God, we do more things wrong. We put all the stuff that we tie when we tie a fly on a hook. There's no hook on anything that they eat. Then we use all this metallic stuff and tinsel stuff and shiny stuff. Nothing that they eat has any of that stuff on it. The fly enters the water from above. The insects they're eating are going up. Your fly's going down. When you retrieve it, you move it in a straight line. There's no way we can make our flies look or act like what that trout sees and eats every day. But in spite of all those mistakes, we still catch fish.
Right.
So guys got to remember, what is the trigger mechanism that allows a fly or a fish to take your fly? Movement. Movement is the key, and it's controlled by how the fly is tied and how you fish it, the retrieve that you use. That means depth. You have to match all those things up. And I just find as long as I'm in 6 feet or less, I can go into a bay that's flat on the bottom. Fish or cruise a foot or two off the bottom. But you can go out in the middle of a bay and catch fish just as well as you can casting in along the shoreline. But if it's early and late, those fish will move into that shoreline, because everything that we have in our fly box, no matter what you call it, mayfly, caddis, damsel, midge, leech, scud, minnow, whatever it is, all of those food sources are found in along the shoreline edge. And that's because of the protoplankton and zooplankton in the lake. That's where it grows. So that's where you want to focus your time and attention when it's the right time. But anyway, trolling is an effective way of doing it, and you will find certain areas where you're catching fish and certain areas where you don't. We'll avoid those. Yeah. And if you find an area that's good, then make some landmarks so you know where that area is, especially if you're away from the shore, so you can go back through it. If you do it and you're catching fish, great. If you stop catching fish, rest it, leave it. Go to another spot, but cover water. And that's as I mentioned earlier, that's one of the most common mistakes that guys make that are especially inexperienced. They stay in one spot too long. Not a good idea.
Yeah, you want to cover the water. Okay, and you mentioned fly design, and I want to dig into that one for sure because you're an expert and you've designed some. I mean, the Stillwater Nymph is one that I've had in my box. A friend gave it to me a long time ago, and I've caught plenty of fish on that. But before we jump into there, you also mentioned a couple of names. I was wondering if you can speak to maybe a few of if there were any mentors you've had along the way that have helped you kind of get to where you are.
I would love to give credit to a lot of people that I've talked to and met over the years, but in all honesty, none of them knew anything about Stillwater. The only one that I found, there was a mentor that he's an Indian, a Klamath Indian, and his name is Rich Henry. And when I bought a resort on Upper Klamath, which is how I learned Stillwater by going out every day, Rich would come in and fish the channels feeding net. And up until that time, Dave, for 20 years, I never saw a single fisherman, not one, fishing that lake with a fly.
Wow.
No one did it. They trolled lures or they bait fished. So Rich Henry is out there, and he is catching fish after fish after fish after fish. And I just had to find out what he was doing. So I had tried it a few times and with zero success. I couldn't get a strike even. So I went over and I asked him if I could take some pictures of one of the big fish he just caught. I don't think he really wanted me there, but he allowed me to come over. What I really wanted to see is the fly he was using. So I got a picture of the fly and the fish's mouth and all that, and I asked him, I said, what is that fly using? And he told me it was a black leech, and I kind of put myself in a funny position. I said, could I buy a couple of those from you? Well, I was already tying flies. I knew how to do that, but mine were too big. But he gave me a couple, and I watched his retrieve, and he used a retrieve that I'd never seen before. It was very short, rapid pull to match the beetle larvae that were in the water that these fish had been feeding on. So when he left, I got in my boat, and I did not have the line that he had. Because I asked him, I says, what's the fly line you're using? He says, it's called an intermediate, but you won't find it in any fly shops. They have to order it. Well, in those days, going back 40 years ago, an intermediate line was only made for saltwater, for bonefish in the flats. There was no freshwater version, but they just started, Scientific Anglers was the first one to come out with it. They just started making them then. So he told me, you need to get one of those lines. Well, I didn't have one, and I didn't have time, so I went up the creek channel, and I had a sink tip line. It was a 10-footer, and I got up there, and I found out I could get by with a 10-footer sink tip, because when I made the cast, one of the things that I found out with his form of presentation, strikes always come in the first few feet of the retrieve. So you're not giving that line chance to sink. But if you come back further, it's going to sink faster, and it takes you out of the zone way, way too quick. So, but in those days, I broke off the very first fish. God, I was so happy because it worked. I caught 3 more before I lost the second fly, but I went back and tied it much more. And he was my mentor, and I fished with him many days after that. And the stories that I could tell you about that guy, he has no weakness. I never found a weakness. He could cast, he knew bugs, he tied, he knew retrieves. There was nothing about his presentation, and he understood trout and feeding behavior.
Wow.
He's still to this day the best angler I've ever seen on the water.
Kidding. That is a great story, and somebody that probably a lot of people have never heard of, right?
Well, those that fish with him know him.
Yeah.
I see him every year. He'll be in Albany, Oregon at the FFF show there every year, and he always stops by my booth, and we have a few laughs and talks, and I owe a lot of what I've been able to accomplish. I had to learn it on my own, but he was the one that steered me in the right direction. I never took a casting lesson or a tying lesson or that. I just trial and errored it, but that's not really the way to go. For guys who want to do this, they need to have someone help them, teach them how to cast, to throw a longer line. You got to be able to throw at least 40 to 60 feet. And so if you can do that, whether you tie or not, you need to know what kind of flies to buy. And when you mention flies, one of the things that you have to remember, Rich, Dave, when you take a fly, if you're in a fly shop or you're tying your own, the whole key to the fly's effectiveness has to do with proportions. How long is the tail? How much tail you put in there? How thick is the body? What kind of materials you use? What we've gone to today in the fly tying industry, good God, it's a wonder to me we don't scare the fish with all the stuff that we put on these things. But most flies, especially if you match it to the natural, we overtie. Everybody puts too much body in, too much tail in. They just put too much crap on them, and you don't want to do that. You want to keep them as sparse as you can. Don't put more than you absolutely need. Like when I do my midge larvae, it's nothing more than black thread from the bend of the hook wrapped back toward the thorax area. And then I put some copper wire over that, 8 turns of copper wire. That forms the body. Put a dubbing loop and put in some seal sub right there for a thorax, and that's it. Nothing to that fly. You can tie a lot of them in a very short period of time, but if all the flies that I fish, and the seal bugger is easily the most popular fly, and I sell a ton of them, because when guys buy a bugger, stop and think about it, Dave. What does a bugger imitate? What do you think those guys out there think that fly imitates? And you'll hear all kinds of things. Oh, it looks like a leech, or it could be a dragonfly nymph or a minnow. It doesn't look like a minnow. It doesn't have fins. It doesn't even have the same color. It's got totally different kind of movement. The reason it works, it's a suggestive fly, as is a leech and minnow. They don't imitate one food source, but they could imitate a whole bunch of different things. And the reason trout take it is the movement. They key off a movement. It triggers a reaction in them. So that's why those flies work. But when you use the small stuff that looks like pupa, there's very little movement in most of those. So it's up to the angler to apply the movement if you're retrieving. But you got to remember, fish, and I'm telling you, 90% or more of all the strikes you'll get on a given day, fish will come in from the side, because when the fish takes your fly, it's a reactionary strike. It's not because it looks or acts like food to them. They're curious. And if anybody's ever caught a fish that was stuffed full with snails or whatever it is, you wonder how could he get one more food source in his mouth? Tell me that fish was hungry. No, he took it because he reacted to the movement that the angler put in there. So that's a key part. But in fly tying, I think it's important that if a guy gets a fly that really works well for him, and this is going to be tough for him to do, put that thing away. If you don't tie, then find someone who can tie and match it exactly, especially in proportions. How long is the tail? How much they have in it, and keep the bodies really, really on the thin side. That's probably the biggest thing that I see guys do. They bodies are too thick and tails are too short. If you have to err, like on a bugger style fly, err on the side of too long rather than too short.
That's right. Yeah, no, that you just answered my question I had for you on the most important thing. And I just think of your Stillwater Nymph. It definitely, you look at that thing, and I'm not sure how many strands of marabou it's got in it, but it's pretty thin. It's got just a few strands on top and a pretty thin body, and when that gets in the water, it's a thin little fly.
Well, you can err on that fly too. On that one, when you use marabou for a tail, there is a point where it can have not enough and a point where it has too much. But you got to settle enough so that when it's wet, it definitely forms a silhouette. It's the silhouette of the fly is the reason trout take it. When I designed the Stillwater Nymph, I was fishing Diamond Lake, and I've known for all these years that a Diamond Lake, the bite slows between 1 and 3 in the fall. I don't know why, it just does. So around 1 o'clock, I went into my truck, and I'm sitting there having a sandwich. I looked up at a fly that I had bought when I was up at Henry's Lake in Idaho, and it had a tied down back. Well, in the fall, I know that fall caddis are out. So I got back in the back. I had my fly tying stuff with me, and I designed the fly, and I used deer hair for a tail and used the excess. Instead of cutting it off, I pulled it over the top when I did the body, and that was the wing case. Well, I got it on the water. Boy, I'm telling you, Dave, I was hooking big fish, bigger than I'd ever caught before in the first few casts, but I could only catch 2 or 3 fish on that fly, and then they broke the deer hair, and I had nothing but a mess. So I found, well, it's not very durable. So I tried paintbrush bristle. They aren't going to break that, but it was so heavy that it made the fly flip upside down. Well, they still took it. So that's when I settled on a marabou tail with a marabou back, and I didn't find that the body was that critical. But one thing I can tell anglers out there that are listening, if it comes to hackle on that fly, you'll notice I have 9 variations of a Stillwater Nymph that I sell. Every one of them has got a burnt orange hackle. And that burnt orange color is an attractor color. It outfishes any other color that I use for hackles, so that's why I only use burnt orange on it, and never more than 3 turns.
Okay.
Like on a seal bugger, never more than 4.
Good. Yeah, and I'll provide some links to some videos or photos, and like I said, wetflyswing.com/64. And you mentioned that the Stillwater, it kind of sounds like what you originally tied was kind of like a tied down caddis. Is that kind of what it looked like a little bit?
It was. That was the idea. I had mine when I did it, was a tied down caddis.
Yeah.
That's why I used a deer hair. But I found that marabou, that silhouette, I've used that fly because it's really a good damsel imitation, but I've used that fly in the fall when there's no damsel on the water. It's December and the water temperature is 38 degrees. There's no damsels around, but I'll put on a Stillwater nip and just slam them, which tells you and reinforces the fact it's food to the fish. I don't care what it imitates. We will never know. But the trout, as far as they know, it could be food. That's why they take it. And you will find when they're not sure what it is that you're supposed to be imitating, the strikes are aggressive.
Yeah.
They're very violent.
And I've used the tied down, just fishing streams a lot. And you're right. If a fish eats it and all that, the back will break on the fly a little bit. No, but I found that the more that it gets frizzled, the better the fly works. In fact, I've had some times where you get a good evening and by the end of the evening, there's nothing left of it. All the deer hair's gone, but the fish are still taking it.
I was living at Lake Tahoe one time and living on the Upper Truckee River, and I went out and I was dry flying it that night, and I was fishing a hole right behind my house. It was I always see fish in there, but at the time I was fishing it earlier, I was running the fly down through there and I was dry flying it, and I caught a couple small fish. Just before dark, I'd gone down the river, and when I got back to that same spot, I was using, there were caddis in the water, and I could hear the fish splashing. I couldn't see them. It was getting so dark. I must have caught 12 fish on 12 casts. There were so many fish there, I had no idea how many were underneath the brush that had come out. By the time I got back to the house and looked at my fly, the hackle was broke. There was no body and no tail left on it.
That's cool.
And yet they were still taking it.
That's cool.
So your point is well taken. Yeah, they'll take it when it gets nice and bushy.
Yeah, that's good stuff. So let's bring this full circle as far as you mentioned the lines, but if you talk a little bit about what the best rod, as far as weight and length and things like that, and then also the leader. Just bring us back so somebody can kind of get the whole setup. The leaders are a real critical part of your presentation, Dave. And I use, and that's what I get my clients to do. I won't fish anything shorter than 12 foot. And I use a monofilament leader, which is not good because it reflects light and leaves shadow, but monofilament has memory, which you can straighten by stretching it. You cannot do that with fluorocarbon. But on the end of a monofilament leader that's 9 feet long, I add 3 feet of fluorocarbon to it. So anytime you add to an existing leader, you must add in increments of 3 feet and come down 1x. So if the leader is a 9 foot 1x, then I add 3 feet of fluorocarbon 2x to it to get out to 12. And for me, when I'm fishing lakes, it's 1 or 2x on the tippet. And guys think, oh my God, how could you use such heavy tippet? That's because they're thinking in terms of diameter and spooking fish. Got to remember, the trout do not spook from fluorocarbon. It doesn't leave a shadow. It's not reflective of light. It has a density the same as water, which means it's almost invisible. And the bottom line, they don't care. So if I can get that tippet to a size, and I can get 1x to a size 12 or 14 hook, then I'm going to use it, because the product that I use, called Sight Free, is the smallest diameter on the market. And I can use it, but the reason I use it is because of the knot strength. It's the strongest. And I learned it from the English national team that were competing in the World Championships 16, 17 years ago when it first came out. So leaders, 12 foot down to 1 or 2x. A guy that fishes the lake with 3 or 4x, he's going to break off fish. Yeah. And those are not the fish that you wanted to lose. When it comes to rods, I would use a 5-weight only if I was fishing indicators or dry fly. Other than that, I always use a 6 or a 7, because you got to remember, trout face into a wind. Never cast downwind when the wind blows, because trout will face you. So when you present the fly, he's only seeing the tail as you come up and you're lining all kinds of fish. You always cast across the wind, which means a 6 or 7-weight rod will do it better. I put a 7 line on a 7 rod or a 6-weight rod. A 6 on a 5, I oversize it 1, because graphite rods today will throw at least 2 line weights. Yep.
Doesn't make any difference.
Gotcha.
That's the way I go.
Okay. And, I was just thinking now, maybe just for the entomology piece, you can kind of clarify for somebody that doesn't know. We were talking pupa a little bit. So with midges, talk about the life cycle of that. Or midges, do they have that pupation phase, pupated phase, or however you say that with the midge, or are we talking?
They do. Pupa, well, on all four insects, I read an article on a guy, and I saw this on YouTube, a writer for Fly Fisherman magazine, and he says that the mayfly does not have a pupa stage. Well, I got news for that man. It does have. You tell me, how does an insect, because he was really a river and stream guy, didn't know anything about lakes, and it was obvious in his article, but he was saying there's no pupa stage. Well, it's because anglers fish in streams and rivers don't imitate pupa with their flies. They either fish nymph on the bottom, or they fish the dry on top. On lakes, the pupa stage is the most critical stage of all insects. So it goes from, larva to pupa to adult, and they'll hang in that film. But as far as a midge goes, midges don't like bright sunny days. You'll find them on the water almost every day throughout the season. Dark days, rainy days, they love it. But anytime the wind blows hard enough, it always curtails your hatch. It stops the hatch because the water gets too rough. Okay. And they can't hatch under those conditions. Other than that, you always find midges out there.
So, Well, the question I had there on the midges is, and this came from a friend who I was talking to. He mentioned like the challenge of when you get into selective trout. Can you speak a little bit to that? How when you have selective trout, which I guess means, I don't know, maybe you can clarify what that means, and then how you catch those fish with midges.
It's because you got to understand, when a trout gets over 15 inches, his what he hunts for, his diet changes, his body requirements change because they need more protein. It's not a matter of how much food is available to them. Every lake has got more food that a trout can eat. You may not think so, but they do. Only acidic lakes are limited as far as what you find in the way of food sources because they're cold, deep, dark, and they're high mountain, and they have a rock base. Midges, you will find some midges on every lake on this planet. But when you're talking midges, you're talking about an insect that is not very big, and they're easy to tie. And the only stage that I found, I don't fish adult midges. I have on a few occasions, but I don't need to. I always fish the pupa because that's what the trout are more interested in, and we talked about how to fish that. But to do a midge pupa or larva, it's just a matter of making a body. You can do it with tying thread and wrapping wire through it. The difference between the pupa and the larva, or the larva stage in pupa form, or the larva form, the pupa has a wing case, larvae do not. Okay. So as I tie the fly, it would have a black body, copper wire or silver wire through it, and then I would form a dubbing loop and put in seal sub, very sparse, 2 turns at the head for a thorax. But if it's going to be a pupa, then I tie on a wing case, pull the wing case over the thorax, and that's the difference between the two flies. One has legs, one doesn't.
I see. And is that
the wings sticking out?
You gotcha. And so then if we were talking about like a selective trout, a trout that maybe was selecting a certain, whether it was a pupa or the larva or a different, is that where you would kind of talk about targeting those fish? Or I'm just trying to get to that.
No, what you have to think. I'm sorry, Dave.
No, I was just interrupt you. No, go ahead. Yeah, I think I just had a question of what selective trout.
Well, when any small fly that guys have, I mentioned it earlier, they're really pupa imitations. So it's not what the fly looks like to the trout. It's the depth that you fish that fly. That's why if you took a hare's ear out in the middle of the calabatus hatch and you fished it below the water, guys might think of a mayfly as a mayfly nymph, but you're really imitating the pupa stage. So pupa have to be fished in the top 2 feet to be successful. If you go deeper, you're getting into a situation where the trout are stationary, they're not moving, and you bring the fly up from the bottom. Yes, you can catch them that way, but once he reaches the top, got to remember when you're fishing and you see fish breaking the surface and rising out there, those fish are cruising in the top foot to 12 inches. There may be fish 3, 4, 5 feet down from where they are. Those fish are not feeding on the same thing that those up above are feeding on, and they're not even moving. So when you put a fly out there, whether it's a midge or a mayfly or a caddis or a damsel, on the pupa form, they're all going to pretty much look the same to the trout. It is the stage of the insect, because it's a pupa, not the insect. Trout are selected to the stage of the insect, not whether it's a mayfly, caddis, damsel, or midge. They don't care.
I hear you. Okay. Yeah, that's great. That's great to hear. Okay. And, so, well, let's see. We've dug into a bunch of stuff. I've got a few more questions here I wanted to touch on, and I think, as normal, I won't get to everything, but, one of them, and you mentioned some of the methods before. I think I was watching a video where you talked about the 5 different methods that you can use. And I guess you talked about earlier where you talked cast and retrieve, trolling, indicator. Were there what were the 2? Well, I guess dries. And then are we missing one
dries?
More?
The 5th one, if you wanted, would be jigging, but we can't jig with a fly rod. Jigging has to be straight down and brought up and let set back down. Okay.
And we talked about Phil and Brian Chan and the stuff they're doing. They've got this concept. Maybe you just speak briefly on this. I guess Phil calls it the balanced leech, and it's with a jig hook. I guess it's not really jigging, but can you talk about that fly design and how? I mean, can you do that without doing the jig style? And I think in the balanced leech thing is you put a big weight on the end of the fly, and what that's all. Is that just for midges?
No, you don't weight anything in pupa form.
Oh, okay.
And anybody that puts a jig means it goes to the bottom. And you jig it by lifting it up and letting it settle back down. That's the jigging motion. You can't do it with a fly rod. You have to do it with a spinning rod, and you got to do it right in front of you. Like when you cast an indicator with a fly underneath it, I see guys put bead heads on their midges to get them down to the bottom quicker. But when you do that, you're only fishing an area 15 inches in diameter, wherever the indicator is above it. So what if the fish aren't where you cast? What Phil doesn't tell you, and I tease him about this all the time. I said, I watch you and your boring method of fishing, I said, but watch what he does. He hand twists that thing back to him, so he's covering a path coming back to him, so he's covering more water. He's not fishing just one spot. So when you want an indicator fish, there better be fish where you're throwing that indicator. Otherwise, I've done it by just casting, using an intermediate line in my midge larva. That fly, for me, Dave, has bailed me out of more situations than I could even come close to counting by simply making a cast and slow pulls or long pauses. Half the strikes or more that I get, I'm not moving the fly. I'm on the pause when they pick it up and take and run with it. So when you're talking midges and on that leech, I'll say this about weighting flies. Every good Stillwater fishermen that I know of, none of them use beads on their flies. Okay. Not single one.
So not even on a woolly bugger, no beads on woolly bugs, any of that stuff?
No, they don't. If you're putting a weight on a bugger, then you're fishing bottom.
Yeah.
That means larva. That's 10%. And if you don't do it, you could troll it. It'll sink a little deeper. You could troll it. Guys will still catch fish. Anytime a fish sees a fly, you got a chance of him picking it up. Stop and think about this. When you make a cast on a lake, if you see a fish working out there 40 feet from you and you cast to him and you know those fish are feeding that upper zone, when that line hits, there's fish to the right and to the left where you just cast, but you don't see them because they're underneath the water. They didn't make a ring. Where are those fish going to be when you start to retrieve? They're gone. There's nothing there. You're bringing your fly back to a zone that doesn't have any fish in it. So if you don't catch the fish that you were catching out there, do you still catch fish? On occasion, because they come in from the side. So anytime you're retrieving on a straight line and a fish is traveling and it's going to cross the line that you're retrieving, when those two lines intersect, you get hit.
Yeah.
Stop and think about this, Dave. Every cast you make on a lake that you don't get a strike, because I'm disappointed when I make a cast and I don't get a hit. But it happens more than it doesn't happen because we fail far more than we succeed. But the reason for it, there's no fish there. They didn't see your fly. Most of the time, if they see it, you'll at least get a strike if you don't spook them with a cast. So you take that into consideration. If you put a bead on it, you're sinking that fly down. The bead on the head of a fly makes it drop in an unnatural manner, and that's why those of us that know Stillwater don't use them, unless you want to fish the bottom or you're going to troll them. That's the only time you can get by with them. Effectively, anyway.
Okay, and just to clarify, as far as I guess we could talk a little bit about boats, but say I'm in a float tube, and when you're talking about doing it perpendicular to the fish, so the fish are going to be coming in from the deeper in towards the shore, so they're going that way. So you want to be basically trolling along the shoreline so you cross their path. Is that basically what you're doing most of the time?
Either trolling, yes,
or
casting. You turn your boat sideways.
Yeah.
You don't face the shore. You turn sideways and cast over your left or right shoulder, and you move very slowly. You kick very slowly, and you put your fly in every 5 feet. Bring it out 4 to 5 feet from shore. If you haven't had a strike, pick up and recast. Because if the fish is there, Dave, the take is going to be instant. They don't saunter up to it and check it out. They don't look at it and wonder if it's food or not. They take right now. They just don't. There's no hesitation, and you cover the water by doing that. Easily, the best boats for lakes are not boats with motors. They're not prams. They're not canoes, because those you're in trouble when the wind blows.
Right.
What do you do if the wind blows? You have to put an anchor down. You put an anchor down, you just lost mobility.
Yep.
Sometimes you have to do it if that's all you have, but it's not the best way to go. If you can kick and control and stay along the shoreline, when the bite leaves the shore, you can still stay in shallow but cast out the deeper water. Those fish will still be there. They're not leaving. They're just going to go to a different depth.
Gotcha.
But they'll eventually start coming up. Wherever there's weed beds, that means shallow.
Yeah.
That's where you want to hang around those spots, because that's where your fish will be concentrated.
So the float tube obviously is good. I mean, do you have a recommendation on a float tube you like to use, or a type of boat where you can kick?
The best boat on the market, in my opinion, is the Super Cap. And I just happen to sell them because they are the best. Yeah. They only weigh 13 pounds. You can pack them up a hill. They are the safest boat, the most comfortable boat to fish out of. Anybody listening to this program and wants more information, just have them give me a call.
Okay, and is the Super Cat, is that the name of the company, or is that the model?
That's the name of the boat. And New World Manufacturing in Cloverdale, California, is the one that makes that boat. Oh,
okay. Great. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that one. That's a good one. I'll provide a link. Well, we'll have a link to your website, too, so they can connect there and check that out. Okay, so we have the boat, and obviously I've got old, float tubes I've been using for years. I've got an old Caddis float tube that's kind of a U-boat that's, it's just been a great boat. It's been sitting. You
got to be careful of those, though, Dave, because those can be tipped over.
Oh, yeah.
And
that's true.
I've never fallen out, and I've never tipped my boat over in the 20-some years that I've used it. It's just a safe, comfortable boat to fish out of. It's got a round end, so you're not blown by the wind. You're not subject to it. But usually when I have a guy or a client that has another kind of boat, try this. Sit in it. That's how I sell them. I don't have to tell them. They go fish out of it and see what you think. Usually if a guy wants to try it, I'll send it to him and try it. If you don't like it, send it back. You're not obligated to buy it until you fish out of it, so you know.
That's cool. No, I'll definitely have to check in on these a little more. And so when you have your clients out there, and do you still guide?
Yeah, I'm only guiding on private water, though. Mm-hmm. I fish mostly public water when I'm out fishing, but my guide trips are done on private water because there's bigger fish, more of them. There's smaller lakes. I can teach a group rather than just one or two people, like I used to do on Upper Klamath, where I took them out there. But on private water, you can get 4 or 5 guys, 6 guys in pontoon boats and spend time with all of them. And before that day's over, I guarantee you they're going to know how to fish a lake. Nice. I won't even let them go home until they catch fish. I'll have dinner brought out if I have to.
Nice. Okay. Well, I have a ton of questions here, but we're definitely, as usual, I won't be able to get to all of them. I did want to jump into a little bit of a rapid fire round if you have a little more time here.
Sure. Sure.
So I've got a few questions that are, some of them go a little deeper, and some of them are a little random. But I always start off with just kind of the 2, 2, and 2, and we've talked a little bit about your top flies. But if you had to say, somebody's going lake fishing, maybe it's Upper Klamath or wherever, what would be your top 2 flies, and then talk about your top 2 tips for Stillwater, and then top 2 resources?
The best 2 flies I fish in Upper Klamath are the seal buggers, either black or olive with burnt orange hackle and tail. Black ones would have burgundy or black tails, and a Stillwater nymph, either olive tail or burnt orange tail. Yep. Those 2 are easily the best that I use.
That's right. Yeah, I've got lots of olive Stillwaters. That's good. And what about just general tips? Do you have like a couple of tips that might help somebody that maybe is struggling to catch fish out there in the lake?
Fish shallow, fish shoreline edges early and late, top 2-3 feet. Other than that, use an intermediate or a 7-foot intermediate sink tip line that I designed for lakes, and they're going to catch fish.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, this is
move. Moving is critical. Is really critical.
Yep. And okay, no, those are great. And then resources. Do you have? I mean, obviously you have some information. I'm not sure how much you have on your website, but are there any other resources out there, maybe online or other books or things that you would recommend? Maybe stuff that's not necessarily your own that could help somebody.
The problem with that question, Dave, is and I don't mean to make it sound like I've got all the answers. I don't, but I'm still learning, and I've been doing it for over 60 years.
Right.
But the books that I've written, when you're getting started in fly fishing, you either get information from a family member, a close friend, or a guy behind the counter in a sporting goods store.
Right.
I have not found anybody, one or two resources would be Hal Jensen, some guys that write and been doing this as long as I've been doing it, but I haven't found anybody out there that understands Stillwater enough to be successful. And the reason so many people struggle at Stillwater is they don't spend enough time at it. If they spent more time, they'd have more answers, but they can call me, we can go over stuff and the stuff that I've done, and all I'm telling them is things that I've learned that work. And when they're talking to someone behind the counter, look at the person that you're talking to. They don't fish enough lakes to give them good advice. That's my opinion, but I'm being honest about it. You won't find guys that know it.
That's valid. So what would be if you had to say, you mentioned a couple of books, do you have two books that you would recommend that are yours that would be the best or you're maybe most proud of?
Two that would be the best for guys to learn how. The last one that I did is called Stillwater Presentation. Everything that I know, just about everything that I know about fishing lake is in there. And the one before that, it's 15 years old now, but it's still selling and I still supply it to guys, is Fly Fishing Stillwaters for Trophy Trout.
Yep.
And it won some awards for Bible on Stillwater, but the presentation book is all of that and then some, because I've learned a lot since I wrote that first one.
Gotcha. Okay, I'll link out to that. And what is the most common question, I mean, maybe we've already talked about, but you get from either your clients or people out there?
They want to know what I do to catch big fish. I fish early and late and shallow, and I fish the small stuff where fish feed. That's the whole key. Catching fish in lakes is using the right lines and fish where they feed. Top 2-3 feet or shoreline edges. That's it. Yeah,
no, this is awesome. You've been simplifying it, so this is hopefully going to be helpful I know it'll be helpful for me. What about a random one here? As far as I'm not sure if you listen to music or have in the past. Do you have any sorts of music or bands or groups or people you enjoy?
I like them all.
Do you? What
country, western, popular music? Yeah, I'm not a jazz or any of that stuff, but I love music. And some of the guys I fish with are they're country western entertainers. And
really?
I've met a ton of people in the industry over the years, and I fish with some of them, and they're good.
Roy, who's been? Anybody that we'd recognize of a singer?
Probably not, because they're up there in years now.
Yeah.
But they were in the entertainment business 30, 40 years ago, but long before a lot of that stuff got popular.
Gotcha. Okay. And what would be a go-to piece of gear you don't leave home without? It doesn't necessarily have to be fly fishing, but maybe just something on your daily, weekly routine. Anything out there is kind of something you use, or it might be while you're traveling?
Polaroid glasses.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
I think those are critical, so you can see when you're on the water. You got to be attentive, watching and seeing fish that are working and listening for rings, rises, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But Polaroid glasses are key to protecting your eyes, but also seeing things that you see fish where you can't see them without them.
Gotcha. And and that's something I hadn't really thought about. I think about sometimes in streams and stuff where that's helpful, but lakes, it's just as important, being able to see down through the water. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this one kind of came to me the other day. My dad just had his 80th birthday party, and some of his old friends were talking about how he, was really into the sports, and it was almost like a pro athlete back in the day. Did you do any sports when you were younger before you got into fly fishing?
Yeah, when I went to college, my first dream in life, I wanted to hit a baseball for a living, and I got fairly good at it, and I was all ready to sign a pro contract I had half a dozen teams, but when I was playing ball, they don't have a draft, 50 rounds of a draft between 32 teams. That's a lot of players being selected. In those days, any team could sign anybody. It just depended on how much money. And all the advice I was getting from guys was make sure you get through your junior year in college so you only have 1 year left if you have to go back. Well, about the time I was ready to do that, we had the Cuban crisis come up, I got a letter from Uncle Sam saying I had to go down and get my induction physical out of the way so I could be drafted after I graduated from college 2 months later. And So I went and joined the Coast Guard, and that kind of screwed up my opportunity to play baseball because you can't be in the service and play at the same time, because by the time I got out, I'd have been 23, 24, and that's kind of old to start a baseball career. So had to sacrifice it for the fishing industry.
Wow, there you go. Wow, you're on the brink of professional baseball. And back in those times, who was a big kind of a hero or mentor in baseball at the time for you?
Well, I was a big Dodger fan, and I grew up in the San Fernando Valley in L.A., so we used to go down and we would don a Dodger uniform and go out and work out with the regulars because the scouts wanted to see how we hit and whether we could throw. So we mixed in with the regulars, and we had drills that they were looking at us. And, of course, it was a thrill to be around all those guys. So for a whole summer being around these guys and running around in a Dodger uniform, you like to think that, you belonged in it, but until you signed your contract, you didn't. And some of the guys that I was working out with, they're all known or in Dodger Hall of Fame. Willie Davis, Jim Lefevre, guys like that. Worked out with Wes Parker, a close friend of mine that was a first baseman for him for 12 years. And only myself and one other guy decided we'd go back and finish our last year, or finish up our college career till we were juniors anyway. But it just didn't work out for me. And it's something, I'm going to go to my grave wondering, I know I can hit these guys. I can hit the fastball. Yeah. I could hit for power, and I was a really good hitter, and I had an extremely strong arm. I was only so-so on speed and so-so on defense. But today, they sign you for potential and pay you for performance. That's right. If you don't have potential, I like the big kids that are jackrabbits that can run fast.
That's right. What position were you playing then?
I was playing third base and the outfield. I had.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, third base. You got to have the arm to throw it across the field for sure.
That's for sure. Or be able to make the throw from right on one hop to that plate, and it can't be any higher than head high when you throw it.
That's right. Yeah. I'd love to hear a lot of the people that are in the fly fishing business. It sounds like there's definitely more than a few that had professional sports. I guess it makes sense, hand-to-eye coordination and being good at that. You'd be good at fly fishing casting as well. So that would be, I guess.
You would think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Denny, I think that's about all I have. Like I mentioned, there's a few other things, but maybe down the line we can get you back on.
I look forward to it.
Yeah. Dave. Before I let you go, anything else? You definitely simplified this and made it super easy for somebody that I think wants to get started. Did we miss anything?
No, but if we did, and there's questions the guys have out there, they can reach me at 541-381-2218, or they can go to the website, send me an email. My email address is D as in Denny, G as in Gail, and my last name is Rickards, Rickards, then the number 9 at gmail.com, or they can just Google my name and it'll get them to the website. And there's a phone number on there, but I'd love to talk to them, see if I can help them.
Okay, and in the next 6 to 12 months, anything new or big that we can expect from you out there, or anything changing?
Oh, you're always learning stuff, Dave. Yeah. I don't know what I'm going to learn tomorrow until I learn it, but there's always something new coming down the horn every year.
Okay, and you're going to be on the
flies, new techniques.
You're going to be on you mentioned the show circuit, right? Coming up here, you're going to be out at some.
Yeah, I'm in it right now. I'm leaving to go do a show in Portland this next week, and then Linwood, Washington, Pleasanton, California, and then over to Albany, Oregon, and I'll finish up right there.
Oh, good. Well, I'm going to be at some of those events too, so I'll touch base with you there and say hi in person, and I'll look forward to
seeing you and meeting you, Dave.
Yeah. Okay. Good stuff. Well, I wanted to just say thanks for letting you go for, providing all the knowledge and stuff. As I mentioned, this is I think that your superpower here is being able to break this down, because you took what I think is a big struggle for people, and you kind of simplify it today. So I think a lot of people are going to get a lot of use out of this. So just want to thank you for that.
Sure. I just hope it helped, and I thank you for the opportunity.
All right. We'll talk to you later, Denny. See ya.
All right. Thanks, Dave.
All right. Bye.
So there you go. If you want to find all the show notes with all the links we covered, just go to wetflyswing.com/64. Another quick shout out to our new patron, Brian Moffitt. Thanks, man. Thanks, Brian. Really appreciate your support of the show. If you want to join the team and join the journey here, go to wetflyswing.com/Patreon. where $1 will help support this little journey here. Thanks again for stopping by to check out the show today. I'm looking forward to catching up with you soon, and hope to maybe see you online or on the river.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com. And if you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes.